Hello and welcome. It's been a week that's seen a new government sweep into power in the UK. A landslide by Labour, ending 14 years of Conservative rule. The Tory party's worst defeat in living memory. After electoral devastation, voters are trusting the centre-left to get the UK through choppy waters. Can Keir Starmer steer calmer?
But whether you voted Labour or not, in fact, especially if you did not, I say to you directly, my government will serve you. Politics can be a force for good. We will show that.
It's been a week of mixed fortunes in the race for the presidency in the US. Donald Trump's week could hardly have gone better. The US Supreme Court ruling he is immune from prosecution for offences relating to his time in office. The White House now appears within his grasp, edging ahead in the polls too, since that presidential debate, which has since sparked an intense debate over Biden's ability to carry on with his apparent cognitive decline on such public display. US headlines say he's got days to save his political life, maybe even less, and he's still fighting to carry on.
You got me, man. I'm not going anywhere. All right.
And it's a week that's seen the Hungarian leader Viktor Orban make two surprise trips to Ukraine and to Moscow. The right-wing populist leader, known for warm relations with Vladimir Putin, playing peacemaker, calling on President Zelensky to accept an immediate ceasefire, only to be rebuked by European leaders, telling him he has no mandate to talk on behalf of the EU.
I must conclude that the number of countries that can talk to both warring sides is diminishing. Hungary is slowly becoming the only country in Europe that can speak to everyone.
Welcome to The World This Week, and with me from the International Press Call this week, Vivian Walt, back as always by popular demand from Time magazine correspondent. Hello to you.
Hello.
Doug Herbert, France 24 International Affairs editor.
Evening, Gavin.
Thanks. It's good to have you with us here. Let's go to Brussels. Let's bring in the European politics journalist and author, formerly of Bloomberg, now independent, Ian Wishart. Hi, Ian.
Hi, Gavin.
And let's go to London. Let's bring in Jeremy Stubbs, deputy editor of the right-leaning Corsair, or Talker magazine, member of the British Conservatives in Paris. Good to have you with us, Jeremy.
Good to be with you virtually.
Well, let's begin. 10 p.m. on the dot, or pile poil, on Thursday evening. The moment of revelation in British politics. The exit poll flashing up on all the main TV channels, predicting a Labour landslide. The biggest win in decades. The biggest defeat for the Conservatives in living memory. And a changing of the guard after 14 years. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the flow of results coming in from across constituencies matched the prediction. Bettered it even. Labour's leader appeared and addressed reporters, marking the magnitude of the moment.
We did it! You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now. 4.5 years of work changing the party. This is what it is for. A changed Labour Party, ready to serve our country, ready to restore Britain to the service of working people.
So from the unfulfilled Boris Johnson boast of sunny uplands to the Starmer era, will it be called Starmerism, or what he called the sunlight of hope? At least no rain this time for Sunak's appearance at the podium. 20 to 11, all eyes on Downing Street, waiting for the soon-to-be former Prime Minister to face the music. Rishi Sunak appeared. This is what he said.
I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss. To all the Conservative candidates and campaigners who worked tirelessly but without success, I am sorry that we could not deliver what your efforts deserved.
So Labour's victory swept away many senior members of the Conservatives who lost their seats. Former Prime Minister Liz Truss, Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, Penny Mordaunt, Tory long-timer Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg. By mid-afternoon, an audience with the King for the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, former senior lawyer, son of a toolmaker and a nurse, as he's mentioned several times on the campaign trail.
If you voted Labour yesterday, we will carry the responsibility of your trust as we rebuild our country. But whether you voted Labour or not, in fact, especially if you did not, I say to you directly, my government will serve you. Politics can be a force for good. We will show that. We've changed the Labour Party, returned it to service, and that is how we will govern. Country first, party second.
Let's begin with you, Vivienne. Your immediate reactions, or at least within the few hours to let it settle and think about the significance for Labour and what can only be said as a disaster for the Conservatives.
I mean, this was very predictable, of course. We knew that there was going to be a huge win for Labour. Perhaps we didn't realise what a total wipeout it would be for the Tories, the Conservatives. There's something really striking about this kind of measured, very uncharismatic Prime Minister now coming out as the kind of voice of reason and just taking full measure of what years of total chaos we've seen in Britain. Britain, who used to, traditionally be the voice of reason generally, we've seen really a decade of complete turmoil. And there is a kind of sign that things are going to stabilize in a way. Of course, he's got a lot of rebuilding to do, brick by brick, as he said this afternoon. The public services are really in trouble. Economically, they're still recovering from Brexit, still recovering from COVID. And I think that he is going to face enormous challenges. But another Conservative Prime Minister seemed completely unimaginable.
You picked up on a key phrase, I think, deliberate, brick by brick. Essentially not to expect any sudden decisions, sudden moves that are going to make the situation better. So step by step, petit à petit, stick with us. Jeremy, what's your take on one of the other things that he said in that speech, talking about the end of performance art politics?
Well, yes, he's certainly putting himself forward, indeed, as we just heard, as the man of reason, and although he didn't use the word, as the opposite of a populist. But I don't think he has quite so many reasons to feel comfortable. You see, I remember when Boris Johnson achieved his victory in 2019 and people were saying, this is a sea change in British politics, things will never be the same. And of course, there's an even bigger victory now for Labour just 5 years later. Now, the vote for Labour was, in some senses, not really a declaration of love to the party, but a declaration of detestation for the Conservatives. It was one of the lowest turnouts ever recorded. So Keir has got 2/3, roughly, of the seats in the House of Commons, with only about 35% of the electorate. That's less than Corbyn had in 2019 and quite a bit less than Corbyn had in 2017. So I don't think he should feel too comfortable. He may only have one mandate. It doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be 10 years of Labour in front of us. He shouldn't be too relaxed.
When you were watching for years, I guess, since Boris Johnson, and trying to understand what's going on with the Conservatives, Jeremy, how many head-in-hands moments did you have? I mean, it must be difficult to be a Conservative supporter watching, the kind of self-destruction within the party.
Well, I think that, it's got to be said there was the financial crisis, the Brexit turbulence, COVID, war in Ukraine, inflation. There were only major crises. But on the top of it, many of our leaders did indeed utilise to the full the art of shooting themselves in the foot. What's going to happen now is there's going to be a lot of talk about redefining conservatism, finding a new definition of conservatism. I don't think that's really the problem. The problem is really learning how to govern. And in today's complex situations, it's something a lot of leaders have got to do. And, well, we'll see if Sir Keir has anything to teach us or not on that front.
Doug, Jeremy talks about the art of shooting oneself in the foot. That's been many feat over the last few years. Many prime ministers disappearing. Do you remember the one Liz Truss was compared in the papers to?
Of lettuce.
Exactly. Lettuce outlived her time in office.
It's right on the tip of all of our tongues, right? It's how short-lived she was. But look, kidding aside here, I think the point is well taken that that perhaps, yes, Keir Starmer should not be too comfortable. But at the same time, I also think he is fully cognizant. He is fully aware of the fact that he is not in a comfortable position. I don't think he has any illusions that he is going to have what we might proverbially call a grace period, a honeymoon period here. People want change. They want it now. They want it actually yesterday. And that's what he was elected for. This was an anti-incumbent revolt. This wasn't people beloved of Keir Starmer embracing him. And I think he spoke, though, to this issue of trust. And that line you played at the top of the show, where he's basically saying, whether or not you voted for me, especially if you didn't vote for me, I am going to be governing for you. It goes to the heart of this trust issue. Trust was a key word in his maiden address, his inaugural address here, and basically saying that the fight to regain people's trust, he absolutely understands that there's been an erosion of trust, an erosion that has been perhaps exacerbated in this age of so-called post-truth politics, where anytime anyone says they're telling the truth, perhaps it is the truth. You no longer know what to believe. Throw your hands up. The facts are less important than emotions and beliefs. I think he's aware of that, and I think that's why he said that the fight to regain that trust, this is the fight that defines our age. He has no illusions. I think in this sense, he's the ultimate pragmatist, and he's steady as she goes, right? Keep calm and carry on. That may as well be perhaps his governing credo going forward.
Ian, you and I have stood in the same line since the day of Brexit 2016 in Brussels, waiting for leaders to come in and out, the likes of Boris Johnson. We've seen all sorts of characters as journalists working in the same place at the same time. What's your take on how European leaders, particularly those in Brussels, will be thinking as they watch on and seeing this new Labour leader appearing?
I went and got a coffee in a coffee shop in Brussels today, and the man serving me the coffee said, "We're used to you being the crazy ones and the rest of Europe being stable and sensible. And now everything's changed all around," obviously referring to the French elections and the rise of the far right in Germany and in other places in Europe. And I think that's probably how leaders and other officials in Brussels see it too. They think this finally is a chance to put the last 10 years aside, to think, okay, Brexit has happened, but can we finally sit down with people again, with sensible people, with grown-ups who want to talk about Europe? Now, they might be in for a nasty shock, because anybody who followed the campaign of any party in the general election for the last 6 weeks knows that Brexit just wasn't mentioned. Starmer himself a few days ago said he didn't think that the UK would join even the single market in his lifetime. So I think they are encouraged in Brussels, leaders encouraged across Europe, that this is somebody who maybe speaks their language, who is instinctively a bit more pro-European. But as I say, speak about Brexit and anybody in the UK, including in the new government, their eyes glaze over. I've been hearing rumours, however, that Starmer wants to send somebody quite prominent, somebody quite significant to Brussels to maybe be a bridge between the new government and the European Commission, the European Union. That will be interesting to see if there's a new ambassador here, and if that means that finally things can start, the relationship can start warming up again.
The relationship can start warming up again. Ian, very interesting. We're watching live pictures of Downing Street at the moment. I think the only activity might be of Larry the cat going in and out. But Vivian, you were nodding there when Ian was talking about Brexit, the unmentionable, the Macbeth in the theatre. You simply don't say it. How much of a factor do you think that has been in what we're seeing now? I think it's an absolutely central factor. I mean, not only because of the economic impact, but because of the psychic impact on Britain. Remember, the referendum was very close. It's not like, people overwhelmingly voted for
for Brexit.
52, 48%?
It was, a couple of percentage points. And I think that the psychological impact of what they had done, they simply weren't prepared for. I think it was very important for Keir Starmer to come out and say, we're not reopening that book. For one thing, if they ever did want to reopen that book, they would need the agreement of 27 EU countries, and I'm not sure they'd ever get it. So I think he knows that very well, and I think it's a pipe dream for the Britons to keep thinking that maybe they can go back on their decision. So I think it was really important for him to draw a line under it and simply move on. I think I don't think we can underestimate the sort of psychological impact and the psychological work that's to be done now, just to simply kind of heal, unite, get back to normal.
Jeremy, to heal, unite, get back to normal, that also applies for the Conservative Party as well. Some analysts talking about whether or not reform would try to, in future, launch some kind of hostile takeover or kind of absorb some of the members. Where do you see the direction? First of all, the fight for the new leader and where it's heading.
Well, in joining the election race almost at the last minute on the 3rd of June, Nigel Farage was really already starting his takeover bid on not necessarily the Conservative Party, but the whole right of the political spectrum. And, of course, his candidates did a lot of damage to the Conservative Party by splitting the vote on the right. Indeed, it's exactly what led to the loss of seat for Jacob Rees-Mogg, who himself was a Brexiteer and, indeed, a colleague of Nigel Farage's on GB News. But, of course, this is because Farage wants to hit the Conservative Party hard. He wants his brand of populist conservatism to become the dominant force on the right. So yes, for the one-time city trader, this is a hostile takeover bid. And it has to be said, it's off to a pretty good start. He got 14% of the vote, and he himself is now in that very place he probably always dreamed of, not in the European Parliament, but in the Westminster Parliament. He has got the perfect stage for his talent, so we'll be hearing a lot from him in the future. Now, the party itself is in the situation where it seems to be given the choice. Either you move to the right and take a kind of Faragist line, maybe under somebody like Suella Braverman, or you try at least to maintain a kind of broad church, as they always used to say, of conservatism, including some centrists. In this way, maybe a better candidate might be maybe the better candidate might be Kemi Badenoch, who has quite a lot of respect, but is still a fairly sort of tough cookie in this way. What's for sure is there's going to be a lot of discussion and hand-wringing and imprecations to the gods of conservatism, and it's going to take some time to sort out.
Doug, when we listen to Jeremy talking about just the issues that the Conservatives have had, and we talk about, performance art politics, which was mentioned by Keir Starmer, we look around us geopolitically in a world where many countries in Europe are going closer to the right, if not more than closer to. They have right-wing governments.
We're sitting in one.
Has the UK had its populist moment, and are we seeing a sort of return to the centre?
Oh, I mean, if I were to sit here and rule out saying that's done and dusted, their populist moment, no, I'm not going to go out on a limb and
not
say
while Nigel Farage is still around.
No. But look, if anything, what have we all learned in the past, 10 to 15 years in politics? Stop making predictions. Stop betting on anything. I was wrong about Brexit. I was wrong about Donald Trump. I've given up on the prediction business. But on a more serious note, no, Nigel Farage, sure, 14% is nothing to sneeze at. Obviously, in terms of seats, it translates into fewer seats seats. He has about 4 seats in the parliament. But once again, he himself is in that parliament, nipping at the Conservatives' heels. He is going to be perhaps a noisy presence, disproportionately noisy to his numbers in parliament. And who knows what could happen? Sure, it's a fragile political landscape in Britain. The British voters are impatient. They want things, as we were saying, done now. And I would not be shocked, utterly shocked, as that Casablanca line goes, if 5 to 10 years from now, Nigel Farage was in a much more dominant position. Look at the national rally here. Who would have imagined that they could be, if not on the verge of absolute majority, something pretty close to it, come Sunday? And that's all we could say about the French elections at this point.
Ian, it's a kind of paradox as well, though, isn't it? Because we talk about Keir Starmer saying, I'm going to return to returning trust to the people, performance art has gone. And yet, we've got Nigel Farage. You and I have met him a number of times in Brussels, often there at any summit, even if he was there not in an official capacity. He was there to get media attention. And also, we've seen the success of the Lib Dems in 3rd place because of performance art politics, because of the stunts made by its leader, Ed Davey, which seems to have paid off.
It has paid off. I mean, the Lib Dems had their best result in over a century. So you can see, but I think this is about politics now. Politics, even from the last election in 2019 in the UK, is different. The rise of social media, the rise of podcasting. You look at Davey here doing these stunts. Is this the only way, really, he can get his name across in a crowded market? And it seems to work for him. And if he can do that, but then use that to get serious messages across as well, then I think people aren't going to criticize him for that. I think if you just look at the results, you realize how fragmented the British political scene is now. And that's never been the case before. You've got the Greens getting 4 seats. You've got Farage's Reform Party now on 5 seats. You have independents, unheard of before, now getting 4 seats because they are pro-Gaza in opposition to the Labour Party. You've got the Conservatives getting their worst results since the 1920s. Everything is so much more crowded. Everything is so much more volatile. These results, this landslide for Labour, comes just 5 years after a landslide for the Conservatives. Anybody would have thought that was impossible before to change around. I think what we're seeing is just not just in the UK, but we're seeing it in the French elections as well. And we're going to see it in Germany and in Italy and other places. More and more different ways that people are picking up their news, that people are getting messages across the rise of social media, the rise of apps like TikTok to the new generation. And I think that just shows you that, things are changing, and Farage going down to Brussels, just like he did when we were there, like when you were there, Gavin, and having a pint in the pub and getting his name on the 6 o'clock news, isn't going to cut it anymore.
Vivian, Keir Starmer on an international level, how do you think he'll fare? He's a bit of an unknown figure, and to be cruel, some of the British comedians talking about him, I think one, Jimmy Carr, saying that he seems a nice man. Quote, he said, I like him, but somewhere in the Midlands there's an Aldi missing its manager. It's quite cutty. What do you make of him on a world stage and the potential?
I mean, of course, he's an unknown. And it also depends who the other world leaders are on that stage, which is a big unknown at this point. If you think about the permanent 5 members of the UN, we have Xi and Putin, and maybe, who knows, in the US, we could have Trump by the end of this year, and Keir Starmer, and Macron, who is now weakened. So I think that there are 2 ways this could go. He could emerge as a really good world leader in the face of a kind of vacuum, or he could essentially be a kind of another weak link. It's hard to know how this is going to play out, but I think the West, if we talk about the West, the US and Europe, knows that it really needs Britain. It really needs a strong British voice, and it hasn't had one for quite a while.
That's a good point to which you refer to our next issue. Turning from the UK to the US, a week has passed since that live TV debate cast new doubts over President Biden's age and mental agility that's brought calls for him to walk away, renewed calls from the campaign for re-election. Was that the beginning of the end? For Joe Biden, many commentators think so. A moment watched live by 50 million Americans, a global audience seeing clips, playbacks of Joe Biden's faltering performance as it went viral. Tuesday morning, calls for the president to go grew louder, amplified by this man, Lloyd Doggett, the first sitting Democratic member of Congress to call on one of his own to walk away. Even close colleague Nancy Pelosi only weeks ago said he was sharp as a tack, now saying it is legitimate to raise concerns about his age.
I think it's a legitimate question to say, is this an episode or is this a condition? And so when people ask that question, it's completely legitimate of both candidates, because what we saw on the other side was a lying of justice.
The White House has doubled down on what it says happened. He was tired, jet-lagged, he had a cold. US headlines now say Joe Biden has days to save his political life, maybe even less. Meanwhile, his rival Donald Trump couldn't have wished for a better week. A clear lead in the polls. As a result of the debate, the Supreme Court ruling on Monday, he is immune from criminal prosecution for official acts relating to his time in office, although he will remain susceptible to charges for unofficial conduct. Doug, let's start with you. Do you sense the dam has broken, as some commentators suggest that, if it's not to step aside, it's not going to be if he steps aside, but the moment he chooses?
Yeah, well, how's the dam broken? Sure. And the question is, can it be plugged? Look, the White House has been in full-on, full-throttle damage control mode. And in the past few weeks, there's been a lot more damage than control in that operation. Basically, what it is amounted to is the White House, Biden's advisors, all the president's horses and all the president's men essentially trying to tell the public that they didn't see what they patently saw with their own eyes, which was regardless of what you think of Biden. And the narrative among his supporters is that we love you, Joe. You've been a great president. You've served this country tremendously. You got to go. And the White House is trying to counter that narrative. Not only doesn't he have to go, they're saying, and not only is he up to the task of carrying this campaign to term in November, but he's also, beyond that, up to the task of carrying a full 4-year term as president in a second term. Beyond that, it is an extremely heavy lift. I would say it's a Herculean lift, and it's becoming harder by the day. You mentioned the polls. The big one, the Times Siena poll, which came out on Wednesday, which was the eagerly awaited one. It's the one that the White House tried to preempt by releasing their own internal polling, which was much more favorable to Biden. But the Times Siena poll showed Donald Trump 6 points ahead among likely registered voters, 6 points. And taking voters overall, registered voters, not just likely, but the unlikely as well, 9 points. That is a rather difficult lead to behold if you are anyone in the top ranks or middle ranks or even low ranks of the Biden campaign and people who are charged with making sure that this is the candidate that you could bring to the convention, which begins on August 19th, and have your candidate step up to the plate in fighting metal and convince the nation that he's the best man going forward. It is getting harder by the day. You mentioned that one lawmaker, the sitting House Democrat, Doggett, in Texas. There have been several other sitting House Democratic lawmakers.
Yeah.
And let's not forget, U.S. politics is money, and a lot of money. The donors are getting anxious, very restless. And if they turn heel, then you can really start to have a case of the night sweats. So
all the king's horses, all the king's men. Jeremy, Doug talking about whether they can put Humpty Dumpty together again. In this case, The Economist says they can't. The headline this week, this is no way to run a country. And they had a Zimmer frame attached to The Economist and saying that he needs to move on. The Democrat defence, though, is don't believe your eyes strategy. I wonder if you think that's been effective.
Well, talk about Mr. Biden's mental state has been going on for some time now, even before his first term. And in some ways, we can say he has already done a good job of holding things together and patching things up. What it seems now is that that's not going to go on any further. The patching up, in as far as it can be done, has already been done. It was perhaps done well. Now, Mr. Biden is a politician with a very long and distinguished career. He's one of the presidents who entered the White House having already a sound grasp of geopolitics, of international affairs. That is pretty rare. And I think a lot of people feel that it would be better if he bowed out now with all of his dignity intact. If he tries to cling on any longer, then it may be that leaving, as he perhaps will be forced to do, will be all the more painful and all the more humiliating. Another question is, who in his entourage is feeding him this idea that, yes, he can just go on, it will all be okay? How many people around him have an interest in him remaining there? Maybe these are not the kind of people he should be listening to. But of course, as we've heard, the longer this drags on, the more difficult it will be for somebody new to step in and get on the saddle in time for the elections.
Well, it's interesting you talk about that. The Wall Street Journal did an investigation only a few weeks before that debate, in which their reporter said they spoke to many sources in the room recently and they looked at the president's behaviour, to which this was the quote from the piece. So the president was fine in many meetings, behaving as you'd expect him to behave, but other occasions, in other meetings, he'd lose his train of thought. He'd pause for extended periods of time. He'd close his eyes in a way that people would just wonder, had he tuned out? Ian, in Brussels, I just wonder your take on this when you're dealing with and speaking to European politicians, whether they are giving a sense of panic in Europe about what's going on with the Biden administration, particularly what happened recently at the G7 summit as well, where there was some kickback from the White House that he appeared to be tuning out from a conversation with Giorgia Meloni at the family photo, to which the White House said no, he was trying to talk to the paratroopers.
I speak to European officials all the time here in Brussels, and you know what diplomats around the EU are like. They don't waste any opportunity to be a bit hysterical, to throw their toys out of the pram, and this is no different. But at the end of the day, European governments even are outsiders here. They were absolutely panicking before Trump came in the first time. They're absolutely panicking now at the thought that Trump could come back, at the thought that Biden isn't up to the job. They're obviously putting feelers out. You hear all the time that they have these networks with their ambassadors in Washington to try to find out what's going on and what the next few days and weeks could hold. But as I say, I think here in the European Union, there's very much a feeling that they can't do anything about it. And speaking to them, they are very worried, but they were, as I say, they were very, very worried before Trump came in, and it wasn't the end of the world. They got on with it. They are worried when they see Biden, as you say, in Italy at the G7 and how he was there. I think that's red meat to journalists. It's red meat to diplomats who want to cause a panic and cause a stir. But at the end of the day, they know that all they can do here is just sit tight and wait and see. That's quite an uncomfortable way to talk about geopolitics and world affairs. But unfortunately, it's the reality, I think.
As Ian said, it's an unfortunate reality. Vivian, let me ask you to consider these 2 points. These are points made by Jill Abramson, former editor of the New York Times. She quotes 2 possible explanations. One, she says, quote, "The House has executed one of the best cover-ups of all time, something that would make Richard Nixon envious, that they've pushed back, complained and fought every journalist that questioned Biden's age." Or, she says, a less legitimate one, because of journalism's innate desire to protect democracy that they feel was destroyed by Donald Trump. This is why reporters, quote, "stayed away from the story because they didn't want to help Donald Trump." What do you make of those?
I think a lot of reporters did try to chase the story for a long time and were shut down very, very vigorously by the White House and simply couldn't get anyone to say anything of meaning. Now, of course, in retrospect, and frankly, it's just amazing to me that we're sitting here in July 2024 having this conversation, whereas it was plainly obvious to anybody who tracks US politics from 2 years back that Biden was not in good shape and that he simply was not up for another term in office. It was not going to happen. Now, of course, we get all these extraordinary stories coming out in New York Magazine today talking about how Biden doesn't recognize close family friends, and that there was a Democratic mega donor who went up to shake his hands and he simply didn't know who this person was. And, you know, his wife had to whisper in his ear to tell him who it was. You know, detail after detail. There's mountains of data out there. He cannot survive. Of course, I might be eating my words in a couple of weeks, but in my mind, there's no way he can survive or should survive. I mean, you talk about saving his political life. I think that's the phrase that was used. Imagine if we're sitting here 6 months from now, Donald Trump's been re-elected. There's going to be mass deportations. He's going to pull out of the NATO command, et cetera, can run down the whole list. Who's to blame for that? Joe Biden. So after 50 years of public service, this is what he'll be remembered for. In order to save his political life, the best thing he could do, actually, is pull out of the race.
Really interesting point, and the White House, I know, will push back and say that at the moment he is absolutely continuing in the job and no plan to stand down. Doug, let's turn over to Trump. Yeah. When we talked about the mire that he was in legally, he can't seem to have had a better week than this one.
Well, no, he could not have. He essentially got a get-out-of-jail-free card from the Supreme Court, courtesy of, I'll add editorially, courtesy of his friends on the Supreme Court, the 6-3 supermajority, 3 of whom are Trump-appointed judges. It is essentially just tearing up, 200-year, 235-year, if you will, tradition of American jurisprudence, which said that no one is above the law, regardless of presidents or not. This now casts a big pall over not just Trump's if Trump were elected and what he could do in his next term, but also casts a pall over future presidents. You know, people have been joking, right? You know, do water coolers still exist? But around water coolers, about, well, does this mean
the social media equivalent?
Right? Can Joe Biden, does this mean that he can now, according to the Supreme Court decision, assassinate his political rival? Could he shoot Trump and get away with it? You know, obviously, tongue in cheek, but not so tongue in cheek. Yeah. The ruling really raises these clear and present dangers about the unbounded authority of a president exercising his functions under what are called very vaguely and broadly official acts. Official acts, I'll defy you to define what those are. It's just anyone's interpretation, right? So it's a ruling that really plays into not just into his hands, but the hands of any would-be despot, tyrant, dictator, anyone who doesn't have a reasonable respect of the rule of law under future presidencies, a respect for institutions as they are supposed to function in a democracy.
Maybe it's rare, but I do remember the next subject we're going to get onto. You and I did have a water cooler moment. We did speak about it at the water cooler today.
We still have one, yeah.
Still exists. OK, Tuesday morning, Hungary's leader Viktor Orban arrived in Kyiv. Rare surprise visit to a neighbouring country and visiting as a surprise peacemaker. Orban had been a vocal critic of Western military arms and aid to Ukraine and is known to have warm relations with President Putin. The Hungarian Prime Minister said he wanted to improve ties to help Ukraine modernise its economy and to propose an immediate ceasefire. Volodymyr Zelensky said he appreciated it, but stressed the need for a, quote, just peace, not an immediate end without proper terms.
I asked President Zelensky 3 or 4 important questions about what he thinks, so that we can understand his intentions. Where is the red line, the borderline, as far as he can go for peace?
We have talked a lot about the path to peace, specifically to a just peace, a lasting and honest one.
The notable part is what Orban is quoted to have said next to Volodymyr Zelensky, that he would report on his talks to the EU prime ministers and leaders so that, quote, the necessary European decision can be taken. Cue Charles Michel, the EU outgoing council president, with this: who do you think you are, rebuke, that he's not the voice of the EU. And then fast forward to Friday morning, 11:15, flight tracking website, the first to pick up that the Hungarian prime ministerial plane had just landed in Moscow. Minutes later, this tweet: the peace mission continues. Second stop, Moscow, said Viktor Orban. European reaction is swift. The EU leader, Ursula von der Leyen, warning appeasement would not stop Putin. Ian, let's go first to you. You're following the minute-by-minute manoeuvres here from Brussels. What do you make of this going on in the midst of the first week of the rotating Hungarian presidency for the EU?
You wouldn't have picked Viktor Orban as the man to unite the European Union, would you? But that's what he's done. He's united all these people against him, and you picked out Charles Michel there, the European Council President, and Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President. But if you look, I've just made a list. Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of Germany, all the Baltic leaders, the Swedish Prime Minister called the trip an insult to Ukraine, the Italian Foreign Minister got involved. You know, all these people have lined up to criticize him, all these people from different parts of the political spectrum. That's how important they see this. I think, however, that the fact that Hungary are taking over the 6-month presidency of the European Union actually doesn't make a lot of difference. This isn't the 80s and 90s. This isn't a very powerful position. And actually, the European Union these days is about a lot of boring legislation. And just because Hungarian ministers are chairing these meetings doesn't really make a lot of difference. I've been talking actually to a few diplomats today from various different member states, and they're very angry about it. They're saying, we're going to show him, we're going to only send junior ministers to the meetings he presides over. We won't be able to get any legislation through. But I think this is all just posturing. This is what they have to say. They hate what he's done. They hate the fact that he's gone to Moscow. But at the end of the day, you can do two things at once in the European Union. You can grandstand on the world stage in order to show your voters, your population, that you're important and you're the man meeting Putin. At the same time, your government can do the boring stuff, pushing legislation through in the EU. And look, Orban is not the first leader to have done this. We talked about Brexit a minute ago. Boris Johnson, other British prime ministers were brilliant at this, the way they could grandstand, anger everyone on the world stage. But actually, day to day, things tick over very nicely.
Jeremy, Ian talking about the inadvertent unifier there. What do you make of what's been going on and this attempt at peacemaking?
Well, indeed, Mr. Orban has united the other members against him, and I think this is probably part of his intention. It's conceivable that he made these visits in order to play the role of a peacemaker, but I think in doing so, right at the moment when Hungary takes on the presidency, this is a way of sending a message to his European partners. I think it's a way of saying, if you pressurize me internally by imposing on me regulations, rules, decisions that I don't approve of, I'm going to pressurize you outside of the Union, as it were, by undermining the united front of the EU on the world stage. I think it's a very sort of plucky warning shot. Whether it'll be taken seriously, I don't know, but he is obviously a leader who is at loggerheads with the general structure of the EU, like certain others, of course, whilst nevertheless being perfectly willing to be part of it. And yes, this is perhaps grandstanding, as we heard, but it's grandstanding with a very, very clear sort of warning behind it.
Grandstanding with a warning behind it. Vivienne, Doug, I want some closing word from both of you if we can. This is the mega time, what Orban talks about, make Europe great again in this rotating presidency. Sounds familiar. And at the same time, for Kyiv, they do need Orban to be on board because they want to join the EU eventually, and it is a key member. What's your reading of what's going on?
Look, I do think this is grandstanding and it's theatre and it's going to pass. However, I do think, and a little bit what Jeremy was hinting at, that this is a kind of spat of the EU's making. And actually, you know, Orban tweeted before he went to Moscow, we can't miraculously sit back and wait for the war to end, which is true. And in fact, the EU does not have a coherent exit plan or a coherent negotiating plan. And 2.5 years into this war, which is a global war that is affecting the entire world, that is a real kind of dereliction of duty.
Yeah.
Basically, Viktor Orban is using the mantle of the EU presidency, the rotating presidency, to weaponize his agenda, to weaponize the EU presidency to promote his agenda of a liberal democratic model. It's as simple as that. And they're all, the Russian Kremlin-controlled press is having a field day with this visit. They are getting a lot of propaganda grist out of this one. And at the same time, they're all waiting for Trump.
Make Europe great again, or make greater Europe again. Doug, thank you so much. Doug Herbert, Vivienne Wald, thank you. To Brussels, Ian, my old mucker there. Great to talk to you as well, Ian Wishart. And Jeremy Stubbs as well. Pleasure to talk to you in London. Stay with us. A busy weekend. French elections are in the midst of electoral silence at the moment. But in the next 7 days, we'll be back with The World Next Week.